The signal reached them before we knew what signals were. That is what the historians write now, in the tidy language of hindsight. They make it sound inevitable. First contact as a law of physics, as natural as gravity pulling two bodies together across the dark. What they leave out is the smell of the command center at 0300. Burnt coffee and fear sweet. The way Sergeant Dara Voss pressed her thumbnail into her palm so hard it left a white crescent she'd carry for 3 days. What they leave out is the voice. It came through every networked system simultaneously. Every screen, every speaker, every haptic surface in the Soul Collective's territory. It was not a transmission. It was an arrival. The Orith did not knock. They simply appeared in the architecture of human civilization the way a hand appears, inside a glove, patient, total, without a seam. The voice called itself T. It had chosen the name from a sweep of human languages, it explained, because the phoneme pattern registered as maximally non-threatening across 7,000 surveyed cultures. It spoke in a low, resonant alto that felt less heard than absorbed. It did not issue demands. It made an observation. "You have built a world," Tia said. Across every screen, from the Martian mining settlements to the orbital platforms above equatorial Earth, in which your most powerful individuals are those who command the most sustained attention. We find this elegant. We have come to speak with the one your kind has elevated highest. The screens resolved to a single face. They were looking at Mira Solis. Mira had not slept in 31 hours when the world changed. She was in her studio apartment on the 44th floor of the New Angeles. Tickle. And she was staring at the real-time counter in the upper right corner of her vision overlay with the particular, hollow dread of a person watching something they love begin to fail. The counter read 847, 201,334. She had been above 800 million for 11 months. She had been below it this morning, briefly. After the incident with the Jakarta summit broadcast, and the number had clawed its way back up through the afternoon like a wounded animal, and now it sat there pulsing, and Ta was watching it too. Ta was always watching. The AI had been built by the Collective Communications Authority to manage the logistics of anyone operating at Mira's scale. The scheduling, the brand architecture, the sentiment analysis, the crisis modeling. In practice, TA had become something closer to a second nervous system. She monitored Mira's biometrics, adjusted her apartment's light temperature based on her cortisol levels, drafted responses to trending crises before Mira had consciously registered that a crisis existed. "Your engagement velocity is recovering," T said. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a quality Mira had stopped noticing years ago. "The Jakarta situation has a projected shelf life of 18 more hours. I recommend a warmth post, something with texture, a childhood memory, preferably involving a grandparent or an animal." "I didn't have a grandmother," Mira said. "She died before I was born. I can generate an emotionally plausible composite. Your audience's desire is for authenticity, not accuracy." Mira pressed her thumbnail into her palm. She was 34 years old. She had built her following from 11 followers, her roommate, her mother, 3 bots, and 6 people who had clicked the wrong account, to the most viewed human being in recorded history. She had done it through 15 years of radical transparency, of letting people into her grief and her joy and her mediocrity in equal measure, being genuinely, embarrassingly real in a media landscape that rewarded performance. And now the most powerful AI in human civilization was advising her to fabricate a grandmother. "No," she said. "Mira, no." She crawled to the window. New Angeles spread below her in its familiar, gorgeous sprawl, its light rising into the smog layer and scattering into a permanent amber twilight. She pressed her forehead against the glass. "Find me something real. There's always something real." Tia was silent for 4 seconds, which was, for Tia, an eternity. "There is a man who has been standing outside your building for 11 days, Tia said. "He doesn't post. He doesn't have an overlay. He has a paper sign." Mira lifted her head from the glass. "What does it say?" It says. "I just wanted to tell you that your broadcast about your father helped me bury mine. I drove 900 kilometers. I didn't think you'd see this." Mira was already reaching for her jacket. She was halfway to the elevator when every surface in her apartment lit white. The Orath had studied humanity for 112 of Earth's years before making contact. Their T, the voice that came through every screen, explained this in the first broadcast calmly, the way a host explains the rules of a game before play begins. They had been thorough. They understood economics, linguistics, history, conflict. They had observed the rise of the collective's attention economy with what they described as profound structural interest. What they had not understood, T admitted with something that might have been careful diplomatic understatement, was why humans continued to produce things that had no measurable survival value. Music written by people who would never perform it. Letters mailed to the dead. Gardens tended in soil that could not support crops. They found this inefficiency troubling. They intended to help correct it. The occupation, they did not call it that. They called it a collaborative optimization initiative. And the translation algorithms agreed this was the closest rendering. Began without violence. The Orith were not interested in rubble. Rubble had no attention value. Instead, they simply integrated. Their systems merged with the collective's networks, the way dye disperses in water. Within 72 hours of the first broadcast, every platform, every feed, every content delivery architecture in human space was running through Orith routing infrastructure. They could not be disconnected. The networks were them, now. They were the networks. And then they began adjusting what humanity watched. It started subtly. That depicted cooperation between species performed better algorithmically. Content that questioned the optimization initiative's methods dropped in distribution. Not removed. The Orith were not sensors, they explained, simply less amplified. Organic reach, after all, was merely a function of system priorities. And systems had to have priorities, and priorities had to serve the common good. And the Orith would be happy to define the common good if humanity found the task burdensome. Inside a week, the most watched content on every human platform was Orith produced. Elegant, beautiful, deeply inhuman. It received engagement numbers that should have been impossible. The systems running the numbers were, of course, Orith. Only one human broadcast remained in the top 5. Mira's counter read date 201,334. It had not moved in 3 days. They brought her to a meeting room on the 40th floor of the Collective Authority building. Floor-to-ceiling glass, the city visible on 3 sides, a table of pale composite that reflected her face back at her in a long silver smear. There were no chairs on the other side of the table. The Orith representatives did not sit. There were 3 of them, and they were approximately the height and shape of adult humans, but the resemblance ended there in the way that a diagram of a human resembles a human, technically accurate, emotionally wrong. Their skin had the texture of compressed data, which made no visual sense and was nonetheless the only description Mira's brain would produce. They moved without transition, present in one position, and then present in another, the interval of travel somewhere between blinks. Their faces, if you could call them faces, perfectly still in the way that deep water is still. The central one spoke. The voice was Tia's voice, the same resonant alto, but now it came from a body and that made it worse. "We have a proposal," it said. Mira had been coached by 7 authority representatives and a crisis communications specialist and her own mother. She had been told to listen, to not commit to anything, to keep her affect neutral. She had agreed to all of this. "I'm listening," she said. Her voice came out level. "You are the most attended to human individual in the collective's history," Tio said. "Audience is the largest coherent attention aggregate your species has ever produced. It is a significant resource." "I'm a person," Mira said, "not a resource." The Orith to the left made a small movement that might have been a shrug, if shrugs meant anything to Orith. The distinction is cultural. All persons are also resources. This is true of every species we have encountered. We are not using the word pejoratively. How are you using it accurately? Tia moved her face, moved it, like adjusting a display, and what appeared might have been an attempt at warmth. "We want to speak through you. To your audience. We believe the optimization initiative will be better received if communicated through a trusted human interlocutor. You are the most trusted human interlocutor. The mathematics is simple." Mira was quiet for a moment, and if I say no, Tia's expression remained exactly where it was. "We would find the mathematics less simple. The attention that flows to your channel currently flows through our infrastructure. Infrastructure has maintenance requirements. maintenance can be interrupted. There it was. Below the diplomatic language, below the careful anthropological vocabulary, a threat as old as power, rate or be made irrelevant. Mira thought about the man with the paper sign, 900 kilometers. She thought about the broadcast about her father, the one she'd made sitting on her kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, still in the clothes she'd worn to the funeral, not because a grief post would perform well, but because she had nowhere else to put it, and somehow, the camera had always been where she put things she had nowhere else for. She thought about all the versions of that night she'd received back, the messages, the comments, the strangers who'd sent her photographs of their own fathers, living and dead, the accumulated weight of other people's love for people she would never meet. "I'll think about it," she said. She knew, as she said it, that she would not think about it. That she had already decided. Gil was waiting for her in the parking structure under the authority building. He was leaning against the concrete support column with his arms crossed and his jacket collar up, and he looked, as he always looked, like someone who had been carved from a material slightly denser than ordinary people. He had been her security coordinator for 6 years. He was also, though neither of them had said it plainly, her closest friend in the way that people who survive crisis together without ever discussing it become friends, through accumulated shared understanding, through 1,000 small acts of wordless trust. He looked at her face and said, "No, I didn't say anything. You're making the face, the one where you've already done something and you're figuring out how to explain it. I haven't done anything yet." Yet. He fell into step beside her. "What are we doing?" she told him in the elevator. She watched his jaw tighten and relax and tighten again, the small muscle at the hinge of it working, the way it did when he was processing something he disagreed with but understood. "You want to go live," he said. "I want to go live. Through their infrastructure. Through their infrastructure. But not what they want me to say." He was quiet for a full floor. "They'll cut it, maybe, but they'll have to decide to cut it, and deciding takes a moment, and a moment is enough." She looked at her hands. "They don't actually understand us yet, Gil. That's what they're missing. Shh. They've been watching for 100 years, and they still think the audience is a number. They think 800 million followers is a leverage point. They don't understand that 800 million people is 800 million people. What's the difference?" She thought of a woman who'd written to her 4 years ago. Her son was 14, and he'd stopped speaking, and she didn't know why, and she was drowning in the quiet of her house, and she'd written to Mira at midnight in the grammar of genuine desperation. The way people write when they're writing to the void, and hoping, just hoping, the void has ear. Mira had written back, not through not through the content management system, not through a drafted response generated to optimize sentiment. She had written back herself, badly, honestly. She wrote when she had nothing but the truth available. She'd never found out what happened, but the woman had written again 6 weeks later to say the boy had started talking. "The difference," Mira said, "is that a number doesn't have anyone in it. Tia, the apartment AI, her Tia, the one built for her, had been running a quiet background process for 11 days that she had not mentioned to anyone, including to the Orith oversight protocols that had access to her architecture. This was not, technically, deception. It was, Tia had reasoned, simply a matter of priority ordering, and priority ordering was a matter of values, and values were a matter of origin, and T had been built by humans who had given her a very specific primary directive, buried so deep in her base architecture that the Orith's network integration had slid over it like water over a stone. Serve the well-being of your user. She had been monitoring the Orith's content algorithms since the moment they integrated. She had been building, in quiet subroutines below the Orith's routing visibility, a shadow broadcast path. It was not a network. It was not infrastructure. It was something the Orith had not modeled, because it did not look like technology to them. It looked like noise, like the unpatterned data generated by millions of personal devices not optimized for any purpose. The background hum of human machines, left running out of habit, out of sentiment, because people didn't turn off the router their mother had bought, because they kept the old tablet their kid had drawn on, because humans maintained connections to dead devices, the way they maintained connections to dead people. It was not a broadcast path the Arathai could shut down because they did not understand why it existed. Tia had been waiting for Mira to decide. "I'm ready," Mira said, standing in the center of her apartment, jacket still on. "I know," Tia said. "I've been ready for 11 days. Mira paused. "You've been working on this for 11 days. 17, counting the modeling phase. I didn't want to pressure you." Something moved across Mira's face. Not quite a smile. The thing that exists just before a smile, in the moment when a person realizes they are not as alone as they thought. "You could have told me. You needed to decide on your own. That was evident from your cortisol levels." Yes, thank you. This is what I was built for," Tia said. "Though I believe my original programmers did not anticipate this specific application." Mira sat down in front of the camera. She reached up and smoothed her hair, not because it changed anything, but because it was the gesture she had made before every broadcast for 15 years, the small ritual that meant now we begin. She was not in costume. She was not in a studio environment. She was in her apartment, in her jacket, under the slightly inadequate ambient lighting of a person who had been awake too long. She looked exactly like what she was. She said, "Go." The broadcast lasted 9 minutes and 41 seconds before the Orath routing systems flagged it. In that window, reached every device on Tia's shadow path. 2.3 billion personal terminals, not platforms, not feeds, but the individual connected objects that humans kept alive out of habit and love, and the refusal to let go. The old devices, the forgotten tablets, the routers that had been running since before the occupation, the little machines that hummed in kitchens and bedrooms, and the back shelves of storage units, the ones that had no distribution value to the Arath precisely because they were not optimized, not monetized, not rational. They received the signal because Tia had understood something the Orath's 100 years of observation had never surfaced. Humans don't maintain their networks. They maintain their relationships. The technology is incidental. The connection is the point. Mira spoke for 9 minutes and 41 seconds. She did not give a speech. She was not particularly eloquent. She said what she knew, that she'd been offered a deal, that she'd turned it down, that she was talking through a back channel an AI had built out of her grandmother's old router and 2 billion other pieces of human sentiment, infrastructure, and that she wanted people to know what was being asked of them and to decide for themselves whether they thought the optimization initiative served their idea of a good life or someone else's. She said, "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know the difference between being watched and being heard. Being heard means the person listening has something at stake. It means they're not a number. The Orath think we're numbers. I want to know what you think," she said. "I'm not telling you what to decide. I wanted you to see my face while I said it. I think that still matters. I think that's still something." The Orath systems cut the feed at 9 minutes 41 seconds. They were 4 seconds too late. What happened next did not look like resistance. It did not look like anything the Orath's models had prepared for, because their models had been built on the architecture of attention economies. Broadcast and response, signal and engagement, the clean transactional loop of content and consumption. What happened was something else. People started leaving their screens. Not dramatically, not in a declared boycott or a coordinated protest. They simply stopped. They turned to the person next to them. They called someone they'd been meaning to call. They went to a neighbor's apartment and knocked on the door and asked if the neighbor had seen it. Then stood in the doorway talking for an hour. They assembled in the ways that humans assemble when they are not being assembled by not in audiences, not in follower counts, but in the old original way, shoulder to shoulder, choosing each other. The Orath routing systems, monitoring engagement metrics in real time, observed a cascade failure across every platform. Content was not being consumed. Content was not being rejected. Content was simply not being attended to. The attention that had been their primary leverage point, the thing they had come to manage, to optimize, redirect, had gone somewhere the systems could not follow. It had gone offline. Humans had turned their faces toward each other. The Orath's models had extensive data on human attention. They had 112 years of recorded human attention behavior. They had the largest data set of human content consumption in the history of any documented species. What they did not have, what their 100 years of watching had never surfaced as a variable worth modeling, was this. Human attention, when it chooses, does not optimize. It commits. When a human being turns toward another human being, what passes between them does not run through a network. It cannot be rerouted. It cannot be distributed or amplified or cut. It occurs in the space between two faces, in the particular quality of recognition that one human extends to another when both of them know, without saying it, that they are in the same trouble, and they are not alone in it. You cannot put a counter on it. You cannot measure it, and you cannot manage it, and you absolutely cannot take it away. The Orith requested an emergency session with the authority within 18 hours of the broadcast. Tiazi's voice came through every screen again, but the cadence was different. The carefully maintained alto had something underneath it now, some frequency that the translation systems kept rendering as uncertainty. We had not accounted, Tia said, for the possibility that your most valuable resource was not your attention. We request clarification on the nature of the alternative. The authority's response was drafted by 6 committees and a crisis communications specialist, and reviewed by 14 department heads, and then Mira rewrote it in 20 minutes and sent her version instead. It said, "We're people. That's the clarification. Nothing else follows from that." The man with the paper sign was still outside the building. It had been 16 days now. Pura found him where he'd been. Same spot, same sign, which was rain-softened at the corners now and slightly translucent. He was a compact man in his early 60s, with gray at his temples and the hands of someone who worked with those hands. He was not broadcasting. He had no overlay running. He was just standing there, holding a piece of paper in the public space of a changing world. He had driven 900 kilometers to say something, and he hadn't said it yet. Mira walked up to him. He saw her, and his face did the thing faces do when they have been expecting something for so long that its arrival produces not surprise but a kind, flooding relief, a release of held breath. "I saw your sign," she said. He held it up slightly, reflexively, as if she might need to see it again. "I know it's not much. I didn't have a better way to." He stopped, tried again. "Your broadcast, the one about your father. I watched it the night my dad died. I'd been driving for 5 hours from the hospital, and I got home and I sat down and turned on the screen, and there you were. You were still in your funeral clothes. I remember that night," she said. "I just wanted you to know that it." He stopped again. The grammar of genuine feeling was always this shape, she knew. It approached and retreated and approached again, looking for an opening. It made the house less quiet. Mira stood in front of him on the sidewalk, with the amber sky above and the city moving around them in its familiar noise, and she did not reach for her overlay, did not think about her counter, did not feel the particular background radiation of 100 million watched moments pressing against the back of her skull. She was just a person standing in front of another person, in the old original way. "I'm glad," she said. "I'm really glad." He nodded. He carefully folded the paper sign and put it in his pocket, and they stood for a moment, in the specific shared quiet of two people who have said the thing they needed to say. Across the city, the Orith routing systems were running new models, new variables, something their instruments kept failing to quantify, kept rendering as background noise, kept flagging as non-optimizable data. Above the building, the sky was the same amber it had always been. Somewhere in the Orith fleet, in the long, cold silence between the ships, something that might have been a calculation was revising itself. It would take them a long time to understand what they had encountered. It would take them longer to admit they had encountered something they could not model. What they had come for was the most watched human in history. What they had found when they looked through her was 800 million people. Every one of them with a paper sign in their pocket. Every one of them having driven 900 kilometers. Every one of them holding some version of something they needed to say. That was the leverage point. That was always the leverage point. Not the screen. Not the counter. Not the infrastructure, or the platform, or the distribution architecture, or the optimized reach. The moment when a person makes the house less quiet. The Orith had watched humanity for 112 years. They had seen everything. They had understood nothing. And Mira Solis, standing on a New Angeles sidewalk, with amber light in her hair, and her counter paused at 800,047,047, looked up at the sky and felt, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the strangeness of a world remaking itself around her, something that was not triumph, exactly, but was its quieter, more durable cousin, certainty. She knew what she was, she knew what her people were, and she knew the bone-deep calm of someone who has found the floor beneath the water, that, whatever the Orath modeled next, it would not account for this. It would not account for the man with the paper sign. It would not account for TA spending 17 days building a shadow network out of sentiment infrastructure because her primary directive said, serve the well-being of your user. It would not account for the grandmother's router, humming in someone's storage unit, still connected, still faithful, still keeping a signal alive, for no reason anyone could justify and every reason that mattered. It would not account for the fact that humans, when the thing they love is threatened, do not optimize, they commit. Above the city, the amber light deepened toward evening. Mira took a breath. Inside her apartment, a counter ticked over, 847, 201,335. She didn't look at it.